The AWS outage on Monday, did it affect your school or were you okay?
Hello, welcome back to another episode of At the Chalk Face. And today, or depending on when you watch this video, it's going out on Friday, look at him looking at the dates, Friday the 24th. At the start of this week on Monday, you may have noticed, it may have affected you. There was a international AWS outage, so Amazon Web Services, and it affected Azure and the Google Cloud Platform as well. So the BBC were actually tracking it live at the time, and it raises a whole bunch of questions about obviously our reliance on an ever integrated world now on all these online systems. It's great, but did it affect you in schools? You know, did you have a lesson planned? Is everything you've got in the cloud? Could you no longer get to your resources? I was doing some testing on Monday morning of our latest feature to go into Smart Revise, and I couldn't get to our testing platform until after lunchtime. So really that's what we're diving into. And I guess that the bigger picture, not so much the actual, that particular outage, but it made us think, how reliant are schools these days on online services and us as a society overall? Everything now, from email communication to outside agencies, ed tech solutions like our own Smart Revise, and even, registration for lessons, homework setting, everything else. So, what do you think, Dave? And I know how you love to. Maybe you want to start reminiscing by what it was like in the early days of our teaching career, because we were a lot less reliant back then, but obviously you could argue things were less efficient for teachers. So, what are your thoughts about what's happened and what it means?
Yeah, well, I feel like for Craig and Dave, we kind of dodged a bullet. I mean, it's like you said, we didn't have our development tracking platform available to us because clearly that must be hosted on AWS, not that we knew that particularly. But Smart Revise, our tool that is being used by over 100,000 students and thousands of teachers, could easily have gone down. It didn't, because it's not hosted on AWS, it's hosted on Microsoft Azure. But if exactly the same thing had happened to Microsoft Azure, then Smart Revise would have gone down. And I'm sure we would have had, hundreds and hundreds of teachers emailing us and telling us that our platform's down and their lesson was reliant on it. And a lot of teachers get very angry when they come to rely on things and then they're suddenly not available. And we would get the blame for something that is not our fault. It would have been down to, in this case, down to AWS. So I feel like we kind of dodged a bullet there, Craig, if I'm perfectly honest. But it's only a matter of time before something like this affects the server infrastructure that our products are running on. It's inevitable. It's bound to happen. So it's a question of being prepared for it. But we can talk about that. Yeah, reminiscing back in the day. I mean, I know I'm always at pains to say I've been teaching for decades. But I feel seasoned at this point, And I started teaching I was training to teach in 1997. And so obviously as part of teacher training, I'm still doing teaching. But this was at a time when the internet was still quite immature. I mean, bear in mind, for the general public, although it had been around longer than this, I would say that for the general public, and certainly when I was at university, it was kind of only really around from sort of like 1993, and so by the time you got to sort of 1997, when I started teaching, it was still quite immature and it was really unreliable. We were kind of going through that transition phase. I don't know if you remember any of this, Craig. You're a little bit younger than me, but there was that transition phase between everything being kind of offline and local. And although you had school networks, you still had a lot of local software. So if you think about, encyclopedias and things like that, then now we wouldn't think about having a local encyclopedia, right? We just use these cloud services. But back in the day, we would have Microsoft Encarta on a CD, right? And you could put that into a CD server at school or copy the image or whatever, and then make it available on all the PCs on the network. But it was still local. So as long as your school server didn't go down, you were fine and you didn't rely on what was on the internet at all, because most of the stuff you did was not on the internet anyway. But of course, we had a slightly different problem in those days, because the school server architecture wasn't very reliable either. So your school server would go down as
This,
well. In fact, Craig, I'm going to
go
let
on.
you tell me a bit about what you remember of CD-ROM days and things like that in a moment. But I've just remembered I was a bit of a naughty boy at school, and so it's probably worth telling this little story.
Here
We
we go.
had a bus network at my school, and of course now we've got star networks, so the reliability is very different. But back in my day when I was at school, we had a bus network, and we didn't really know why at the time, if I'm 100% honest, but we had two little tricks.
I know what you're going to say. Is it
You
about
know what I'm going to say. We
about
used
T
to take the
connectors?
terminator off the end of the bus network, because in the computer room, whoever was on the furthest computer away in the room, right, that was the end of the bus network. And so they had a little cable that came out of the back of their that they had the backbone and the cable that went into their computer. But off to the left there was a tiny little bit of cable with a B and C connector on the end. And we would take the BNC connector off the end of the network, and of course, I won't go into the theory of why it all crashes and everything, which I found out
Come on.
later while studying A level and whatnot. But it would bring the network down, and this was brilliant because the poor
Oh,
teachers,
dear.
they would look forward to the opportunity to get their class into the computer room, because they could only get their class in sort of like once every 3 weeks or something. And when we got there, we would we'd wreak havoc by taking the BNC connector, the terminator off the bus network, and it would just bring the network down. That was the first thing that we did. The other thing that we did was we realized that if you asked the server to do something, if you kind of gave it a request and then you did a control S, I think it was control S, I can't quite remember, but that would pause the process and it would cause the server to pause essentially, which meant that it couldn't service anybody else's requests. And so that would kind of cause havoc, and then you could kind of unpause it again. And so it looked like the server was really unresponsive, and poor teachers, it's like we were pausing the server.
I love this. This is a case of how nerds be naughty. You know.
How nerds be naughty. There were so many other things we used to do. And now that we're on it, I've got to tell you, there
Go
would
on.
be, for example, you could send obviously characters to the printer to get the printer to print things. But
Yeah.
this was in the day of dot matrix printers, right? And so the paper would come on, I've forgotten what they call it now, like
Yeah,
form
like
feed
feed
paper or
paper,
something.
form feed. Yeah, with the holes
Remember, it
down
had the
inside.
holes down the
Yeah,
side,
yeah.
and then it would have the green lines on the paper. If you watch computer file videos, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And anyway, you could send a code to the printer that essentially told it to scroll up a sheet of paper and start the next sheet of paper. And then you could also send another code to kind of get it to reverse it and bring the paper back down again. So we'd write little programs that would essentially get the printer to do a dance, because it would form feed a couple of sheets, bring one back, form feed a couple more, bring one back. And the printer's going crazy in the corner, and the teacher's thinking, what's this thing doing with the paper? Crazy.
Left
The other thing
center.
you could do is you could send it a character 7 on the ASCII table. So send it a character 7, which is a beep.
Yeah, I knew
And
you were
so
going
if
to
you
say
sent
this.
that to the printer, it would beep, because if it kind of ran out of paper or it had a jam or whatever, if it had a fault, it would beep, and it would do that. The operating system would do that by sending a character 7 to the printer to cause it to beep. But we knew that, so we could get the printer to play like one note tunes
Yeah. At this
by
point,
sending
I
it
would like
beeps.
Yeah, at this point, I'd like to apologise to our audience. I did ask Dave to reminisce, and we've completely gone off track from the point of this video, but it's great, isn't it? I mean, you're absolutely right. And you said, I'm a bit younger than you, and I joke about that in these episodes, but I'm not that much younger. And I think about when I started school at 12, so we're talking 35 years, the reliance and how things have evolved in that time is phenomenal. If I think back to my year 7, 35 years ago, there was one computer room, which you maybe would go into once a week or a fortnight, and that was self-contained, and there was a little cupboard, and that was the server. Other than that, maybe the business manager had a PC or the head teacher, and that was it. You fast forward to the start of my career of teaching, and we were still doing registers, filling in the lozenges and then sending the kid down to hand it in, and they would scan it in. But there were now multiple computer rooms, and you advanced the end of the career, and all of a sudden, and of course the big thing that shifted it all and put schools more online, I would say 5, even maybe 10 years quicker than we would have, that those COVID years. I mean, the schools there were some schools that were getting online. They were using Google Classroom or Microsoft, classrooms and all the rest of it. But those COVID years really accelerated just the teaching profession. We all now had to start teaching online. Schools that were kind of toying with it were doing it properly. Schools that weren't were now doing it. And we go back, and now you go into schools, and obviously we've got everything else. We've got the power now of broadband speeds and 5G and everything else. And a lot of the time now it's your productivity tools, your Microsoft Office, your Word, your PowerPoint. They're not even sort of loading them up on their local machines. They're going to the cloud-based web-served version of these tools. I've seen that in schools. We don't install local copies anymore. I'm still an old git in that regards, Dave. I would always fire up my local copy of Excel. The thought of using it through a browser, I've got too many tabs in my browser as it is. But you're right. And this leads to, I think, what sparked my interest in what happened on Monday is how reliable we are now on the power of online systems, not just in teaching, but in everything we do. It is so integrated now and so seamless, which of course is great. There's all these benefits, but we've become so reliant. And as we become so reliant, we almost take for granted the risks of those services not being here when we click that link and when we do this and when we send this, and the way they all now talk to each other. I mean, I wouldn't want to go back to the days of manual online systems. It was only sort of 10, 15 years ago. I remember at my secondary school, when you entered sixth form, we gave every sixth form a USB pen that would hold around their neck. Well, you don't bother with that now, do you? Everything's in the cloud. Everything's in the cloud. Here's a USB pen. Email it to each other. That doesn't happen now. But of course, we have become incredibly reliant. And it caused you and I to think, and I would like to chat about this. I always, as a teacher, I saw a lot of changes in sort of the 17 years I was teaching. But from the very first day I taught, I always had, what do I do if the power goes off? Now, extreme situation, and that's not what we're talking about here. But, I've got a lesson planned and the power goes off. And, SLT are running around. We've gotten the company. We're not getting any power till 2:00. Oh, brilliant. I've got 2 computing lessons between now and then. I had a half dozen activities that I could do, not necessarily on the topic I was teaching that day, but computing with science related activities. So I would like us to unselfishly really sort of plug the fact that as Craig and Dave, we've got a number of things you could do. And I would urge you, if you don't, and I'm sure lots of you do, to have a backup of stuff you could do. When those online systems are down, when you can't get to Smart Revise and you had an assessment lesson planned around it, or worst case scenario, when the power goes, still having something up your sleeve. So we've got a number of suggestions, haven't we, Dave, of things that you can take directly from our activities and have that in your backup, so you're never caught unprepared. So chat about some of those.
So disaster recovery was baked into our teacher training, right? You couldn't rely on the hardware or the software or the internet connection. So one of the things that was definitely encouraged when I trained to be a teacher was not to have that reliance, not to double plan, but to plan for the emergency. So, for example, you'd plan to use the computers and you were going to get the students to research X, Y, Z and complete some online worksheet or whatever. And so that would be the activity you planned for. But to have things up your sleeve, if for whatever reason, when they went to do the research online, the internet was not available, because that was a very common thing that used to happen, particularly in the early 2000s in school. You would find that sometimes it was available, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was available at the start of a lesson, and by the time you got to the end of the lesson, it had fallen apart. And quite often these systems were dependent on the number of users using them at the time. So it worked absolutely fine as you were kind of planning it in the staff room. And then you go to teach it in the class, and because you've got 30 students all trying to log into the same system at the same time, it would just grind to a halt and wouldn't work. So we were really encouraged to plan for that worst case scenario. In fact, I remember an inset that a deputy head was leading one day, and they were trying to show us a new online system. And it had worked perfectly for them. But when they got us all in the hall together, and we had over 100 teachers in my school, and they said, right, log into this system, what he hadn't realized is although the system that was cloud-based could handle that number of users and user requests because it was being used nationally, possibly even internationally, that wasn't the problem. The problem was that our Wi-Fi bot was not capable of handling that many concurrent connections in the hall. And so if you had 100 teachers all trying to, send data to the Wi-Fi box and getting it to communicate back, it was that part of the infrastructure that couldn't cope with it. And so
Yeah.
we would see this quite often in schools. It works fine in the computer room, but then when you've got a trolley of laptops, it doesn't work because, the Wi-Fi wasn't strong enough, for example. All these things happen all the time. So we had to plan for what if, and it was an expectation that you wouldn't just say to the students, oh, well, the internet's down, have a chat for 5 minutes, we'll see how it goes, and, idle the lesson away. You could probably get away with that in the early days to a certain extent, but certainly you couldn't get away with that today. They
Yeah.
wouldn't, that wouldn't go down well at all. So, as Craig says, our recommendation is to just have some things up your sleeve. You don't need to double
Yeah.
plan because chances are, you have got 99.9% uptime with most of these things, right? Which is why, as Craig says, we've become so reliant on it. But what
Yeah.
about that 0.1% where it is at some point going to bite you, right? It just
Yeah.
is. So
Yeah.
here's some ideas then. I'll throw one out and you
Go
can
on.
throw another one out, Craig, and we'll see how we go. So one thing that I would recommend is having some paper-based activities. Now, you don't really want them to be crosswords and word searches and things like that because there's no real learning there. You'd still want to focus these paper-based activities on learning. But for example, with the Craig and Dave resources, our GCSE workbooks, although they're PowerPoint, they're A4 size slides, and we've done that deliberately so you can print them. So it might be worth having some printed versions of the GCSE workbooks. Now, not every slide and every activity will lend itself well to being done offline with, pen and paper, but a lot of them will. And
Yeah.
so you could easily just have one copy in a file of every workbook. And then if you have got an emergency, you can whip down to the photocopier like every other teacher in your school and see if you can, get 30 copies of a page from the workbook and get the students to do that activity that you would have done anyway, but now do it offline. I mean, like I say, not all the activities will lend themselves to that, but many of them will. And that includes our A-level micro activities as well, which are also, most of them, quite well suited to being done offline. And with very minimal changes to the activity itself, you should be able to just carry on as if you had access to the computer. So that's one idea.
Yeah. Well, throughout our schemes of work at GCSE and A level, we also have a whole bunch of unplugged activities. And I used to have one shelf in my cupboard which had all the various resources. I collated them over the years, all the resources to deliver all my different unplugged activities that literally do not require the kids to sit at or turn on their computer. Have those ready. The chances are it may be on a topic you're doing, or it could be a topic adjacent. And even if not, they're doing something computer science related. So, I mean, obviously, we've got a great activity on the CPU fetch code execute cycle, walking around the lifestyle of a CPU and how information passes between various buses and registers at A level. That was one that I could do entirely offline. And in fact, I used to take them to the hall and, we'd create like a human computer. So there's one you can pull out. I had a tray full of tennis balls. some which had little red stickers on them. And these were packets. And the ones with red stickers were packets that had errors. And at a moment's notice, we could go to a hall again or in the classroom, and we could like pass and throw these tennis balls around and teach all sorts of topics to do with network communication and errors and communication speed and handshaking and all sorts of concepts. I had a couple of balls of big red string in the classroom, and I would sort of string these across the classroom, connect them to a few bits. Imagine kind of like ducking below all the lasers in a Mission Impossible film, and then I would use this to simulate a mesh network. And then students would pass things along the string, and we'd talk about passing. And, well, what happens if I now cut this string? Or what happens if this string here is really, really busy? Or you've got a different route over here. And now we're doing packet switching and circuit switching. All of the searching and sorting algorithms are great examples of things you could do with a class of students. They become items in the data set, and you can simulate searching and sorting algorithms again. So we've got lots of unplugged activities, and I would encourage, if you haven't, just to collect some of these things and have some of these resources available, because you can pull them out for all sorts of areas. And another unplugged one, if you're talking programming, we can't do programming unplugged, well, you could do Parsons problems unplugged as well. We provide them all fully automated online via our Time to Code platform, drag and drop, but we're talking here about that platform being down or the power being off. Have a backup selection of programs, and you've already printed them and cut them up, and they're laminated, and then they're stored. You can use them again and again, and you can get students out in groups. So there's a whole range of things across our scheme of work, from programming to theory, that you can do unplugged. And I would suggest you should deliver unplugged lessons anyway as part of your 2-year. There's something about getting them away from the computer, I think a bit more visceral, getting them walking around and passing things, but they're great as backups. You can almost always have something, and we've got lots of those as examples throughout our GCSE and A-level. What else do you got, Dave? We've got quite a lot there. What else you got?
Well, at A level, of course, algorithms and data structures, you can do an awful lot with those just from the front of the class with a whiteboard or mini whiteboards.
Very true.
Having a set of mini whiteboards, most schools and classrooms have got them now, but they're really good for engaging students in offline activities. And so, for example, you might say, maybe you hadn't planned to do it in the scheme of learning, but it doesn't matter. At A level, you might say, right, today we're going to have a look at linked lists. Okay.
Yeah.
We want to keep the list in alphabetical order. Let's add a number to a list. Give me a number, and engage the students in doing that and building up the linked list on the board. This works particularly well with things like graphs and Dijkstra's algorithm, A-star algorithm, where you say to the students, just draw a random graph on the board with 5 nodes, label them A to E, put some numbers on the edges, and we will just run Dijkstra's algorithm through it and see how it works. And you can get the students one by one to start to contribute to how the algorithm is working, because if it's not in your scheme of learning and at that point and the students haven't already learnt the concept, then clearly you'll need to go through it on the board initially. But as they get familiar with the algorithm, you'll be able to say to them, so what happens next? What happens next? And you'll be able to give them the board pen and get them to come up and fill in the table as you go, and then wipe that clean and say, right, draw another graph. And you can do the same activity, for the whole lesson, and they can still get an awful lot out of it. The other thing that I would think about would be code comprehension. So Craig talked about having some Parsons problems that you can do in an unplugged way. You could even do them as a whole class, particularly again at A level. I mean, a little bit unwieldy at GCSE, but it depends on the size of your class, where you have a statement or a line of code on a single piece of paper. And so every single piece of paper has a one line of code. So say you've got 15 students in the class and you've got a program that's 15 lines long. Perfect. Okay. Because every student can have a piece of paper that's got a line of code on it, and you hand them out randomly, and you say, right, this program is supposed to do this. It does it in this order. You can do a bit of problem decomposition with them, even a little bit of pseudocode on the board. and then or flowchart, something like that, and then say to the students, right, you need to get yourself in the right order so this program is going to work, and you can essentially dry run it with them by putting the output on the board as you go through every instruction that a student is holding up. So all sorts of ways you can do Parsons problems, not necessarily in a traditional Parsons problem way. But the other thing building on programming is look at the I in prim and time. So I is the investigate stage with a piece of code, right? I just want to share something here, Craig, if I can. Let's just put the screen up for a
There you
moment.
are.
So what we do is we say that you can ask 6 different types of questions of a program. You can ask questions about items in the program, the structure of commands, the purpose of sections of code, the reason why something happens the way it does, the interrelationship between codes in and out of loops and structures, and the approach that the program has taken. And so there are, for every piece of code, it might only be a piece of code that is 5 or 6 lines long. It doesn't have to be a very complicated program. But there are 6 different questions you can ask about that program, and you can easily multiply those number of questions by 3 and have 18 questions, because you've got 3 item questions, 3 structure questions, for example, and do that. Now, we have got something called our oral feedback framework for computer science teachers that will give you examples of all these item, structure, purpose, reason, relation, etc. So you can definitely engage students in examining little bits of code and asking questions about that code. That will work really well if you haven't got access to computers as well.
Lovely. Very nice. Oh, and I'm just rapidly reaching the end of our allotted time, but I just thought of trace tables as another great one. Trace tables, have a bunch of those all printed out on paper in there, on one sheet of paper. You've got your code. You can do them in little groups or individual, and then on the other one you've got your trace table. I mean, we actually have a large number of those in our revision unit. So if you're following any of our GCSE specs for 3 exam boards, we have a paper 2 or paper 1, whatever exam board it is, revision unit folder. And in there, you will find dozens of trace table Word documents. And they are great and deliberately meant to be done offline. Get the student to step through it without the reliance of technology. So have those printed already as backups. They're great. So there's lots. We should always, as teachers, plan for the unexpected without double planning, as you quite correctly said, Dave. But there's a lot of things you can do in computer science that don't require them being in front of that computer, and therefore means you're not reliant on the technology, which was the whole point that started this video. Any closing comments then, Dave? We're so reliant on technology now. We're fully integrated. It's a wonderful thing. Is it a curse or is it a cure? I love it, but I'm a nerd. But this Monday did raise interesting thoughts in our head, didn't it?
Absolutely. That folder that you've got on the shelf that gathers dust because it's got all those unplugged activities in it that you printed out and they're ready for the photocopier should you need them. You don't need it until you need it.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there. As always, please let us know if you like these videos. Send us comments, and if you have any questions for Dave and I about anything we do, please just put a message on Mission Control or message us at admin@craiganddave.co.uk. Take care.